Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Collaborative Science for Estuaries webinar series. This is Nick Soberall with the Science Collaborative. Thanks for joining us for our first webinar of 2022, which is featuring some speakers. We have one returning face and two new faces to the webinar series. So I don't want to say too much in the intro comments here, but just for some brief housekeeping stuff, you can ask questions at any time, and we encourage you to do that as they occur to you by entering questions into the GoToWebinar questions feature in the console there. Organizers are the only ones that can see those questions, so we'll have to verbalize them for you, but please do just jot them down as they occur to you. So with that, I really don't want to say a whole lot of intro myself because I'd like to leave that up to Doug. And Doug is a familiar face to those of you who have attended webinars with us before. He's moderated quite a few discussions for us. We always love having him here. A brief intro to Doug here, just for those of you who don't know Doug. He is our Science Collaborative Program Manager at the NOAA Office for Coastal Management. He's a geological oceanographer by training, and he has worked throughout the West Coast as a federal scientist, state resource manager, and environmental consultant with projects ranging from estuary restoration and living shorelines to regional sediment management and climate change adaptation. So with that, I will hand it over to Doug, and he's going to take us through the rest of the webinar.
All right, thank you, Nick. I think I've said it before. You all keep inviting me back, so I keep coming back to do more. So yeah, so thanks for the introduction. And it's always exciting to come to these and share what the collaborative is doing. I know I always learn from these webinars, and really want to thank the audience for sharing your time with us today. And we hope this is going to be fun and informative this afternoon or this morning, wherever you may be watching this right now. Before I get into our topic with Kaitlyn and Aimee, I do want to take a step back, so we can go to the next slide, and talk just briefly about the National Estuarine Reserve System. So the NERRS, for short, is a network of 30 reserves across the nation. Welcome, Connecticut, if you're out there. It's our newest one, and just joined us designated in January. So welcome aboard. And it's a NOAA program that works in collaboration with a local partner, be that a state agency, a university, or a nonprofit organization. And each reserve site includes programs on land stewardship, research and monitoring, training, and education. And the Science Collaborative, which I'm fortunate to be working with from the NOAA side of it, is a program that fosters collaboration and supports science for estuarine and coastal decision makers. And we do that by providing funding opportunities, supporting user-driven collaborative research, assessment and transfer of information. And these activities all address critical coastal management issues that are identified by the reserves throughout the nation. And the research, as you can imagine through the name, is highly collaborative. That's a key component of this effort. And it's integrating the end users, those who are going to be taking that information and applying it into the research process in the beginning to create the products that stimulate application and usability for better coastal management. So our webinar series, which is a couple years old now, and Nick has done a fantastic job curating it. So thank you, Nick, for all of your hard work behind the scenes, as well as the Michigan team that supports all of this. Often focuses on collaborative projects as they're nearing their end of their project span, and what they have achieved. And the teams bring, they're excited to share their great science and their tools, their resources. It's exciting to see the projects at that phase because the information is already or ready to be used by the end users. And that's part of the story. That's the end of the story. But there's a beginning of the story too, and that's something that we are going to be exploring today, which is the beginning of the process, which is the connections, the partnership building, all these important pieces that begin to build towards a collaborative research project, a collaborative science project. So we're going to look at this through two examples of how partnerships and collaboration has built clarity around the needs, the roles and the next steps for addressing coastal issues at two particular sites. So some of the work that you'll hear about today was made possible through small amounts of funding. So we aren't talking about large RFP, mini zeros. We're talking about $10,000 pots of money. So pretty small. And these are offered by the Science Collaborative to start conversations, to build these partnerships and other activities that ultimately can lead to a science collaborative project. And we call these pots in our program capacity building, but these pots kind of exist in a lot of different places as well. Many agencies and universities have these little seed funding type of pots. So if what you hear today sparks some ideas within something that you'd like to pursue, really encourage you to look around in your own organizations. There might be similar kinds of funds that exist right in your own backyard or in your marsh. So our two guests today are on the forefront of partnership building as playing the roles of coastal training program coordinators, or CTPs in short speak, at their respective reserves. And I think I've said partnership at least 4 times in the last 4 sentences. And I think that's really an important element of what the NERRS and what the CTPs really embrace, which is that partnering. That's how the reserve system is a system, and both across the nation and then in their region and where they exist locally. And it really is important that this partnering is that investment that leads to many expected and unexpected opportunities that develop down the road. So we're going to talk with both of them, with Aimee and Kaitlyn, and I'm going to stop talking now as we move into listening to our guest speakers. So our first speaker is going to take us to Florida. So Kaitlyn Dietz is the collaboration coordinator at the Guana Tolomato Matazanes, or GTM for short, because that's an easier way to roll off the tongue, research reserve, where she helps translate science into application and action. Kaitlyn graduated from Georgia College and State University with a BS in biology, and from Jacksonville University with an MS in marine science. So welcome, Kaitlyn. Thank you for being here, and go ahead and take it away. Yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Thank you, Kaitlyn. We'll get you back online here. So we'll shift to the West Coast. So let's welcome Aimee. So Aimee Good is at the San Francisco Bay Reserve. Aimee has over 2 decades of experience leading wetland and coastal training programs in the San Francisco estuary, and she finds any excuse to be out in the reserves. I love that. I'm sure many people have that same energy inside, working with decision makers, stakeholders, partners, and neighbors. And her work has ranged from adaptation planning and nature-based solutions, wetland monitoring and delineation, to migratory bird tracking. So welcome, Aimee, and let's learn about how you approached a pesky road situation.
Yes, very pesky road. So thanks, Doug. I'm Aimee Good, and I'm a CTP, Coastal Training Program Coordinator for the San Francisco Bay NERR. And I really think of the NERR, our reserve, all reserves, as a partnership. And so our state partner is San Francisco State University, and we're based, our headquarters is in Tiburon at the Estuary and Ocean Science Center, which is their marine lab. So we don't have a physical presence at our reserve sites, but I do want to take a minute to acknowledge and recognize the Coast Miwok as stewards of the land I work and reside on in Marin County since time immemorial. Today, they are federally recognized as the Federated Indians of Great and Rancheria, and we want to acknowledge that the land, water, natural resources, and cultural places of China Camp are integral components of their history and identity. So today I'm going to talk about China Camp, which is in the lower estuary, but our other reserve site is at Rush Ranch, which is in Solano County. A road runs through it. So here's our project site, China Camp State Park. It's a state park with a county road that bisects the park and the marsh, as you can see in this picture here. So the problem, this is a reserve site for a very specific reason. This is a very sensitive and rare habitat. It's home to multiple endangered species and one of the only intact millennial marshes, relatively undeveloped in the entire region. And it's very unique because we have actual ridge to bay open space that doesn't have much infrastructure aside from this problematic road. So it's a 1,600 acre park. And it protects about 100 acres of wetland, which, on the East Coast is not much. On the West Coast is, pretty fairly sizable. We have salt marsh, muted tidal brackish marsh, and freshwater marsh as well as neighboring mudflats, cobble beach, and rocky shoreline. So the surrounding hills rise really steeply from the marsh area, but it does provide some area for marsh transition, and that's another important aspect that we're kind of keeping in mind as we're looking at this work. So during extreme tides or weather events, this road floods, creating a huge problem for emergency access, recreation, transportation, and not to mention all of the issues caused by the very undersized culverts that go under this road. So the marshes on the upland side of the road are muted because they are not receiving full tidal action. The current existing problem is only going to get worse and worse as we're facing sea level rise. And, when we started talking about this, there was no clear path towards the best solution. So in 2017, we decided, the NERR team, to apply for these capacity building grants from the NERRS Science Collaborative. So we wanted to just basically move the conversation forward and really determine what the appropriate role was for the NERR in solving this problem. This road, as you can see on the map, the pink is the low-lying areas that currently flood. And, being a lot of parties involved, no one really taking ownership of how to tackle this problem, we sort of wanted to step in as sort of a neutral information source of what was going on and understanding a lot of the dynamics around the road. So the application to get the capacity building grant was a very simple process. And like Doug said, it's a very small pot of money, but it really, for us, had the potential to have a very big payoff. So we hosted a symposium called Linking San Francisco Bay NERR Science to Stakeholder-Driven Climate Adaptation in the Gallinas Creek Watershed, San Pablo Bay, California. So if you can see on the top left of the map, that's the Gallinas Creek that dumps out into San Pablo Bay. So we gathered local stakeholders for one day to sort of highlight the resources that the NERR could provide. So instead of asking for others' help, saying this is what we could bring to this tricky problem, talking about our data, our system-wide long-term monitoring, and educational and training opportunities as well that the reserve provides. So while part of the watershed, our reserve had not been closely tied to the community at large. And one of the main goals of the symposium was to build greater awareness of the NERR, but also a better relationship with this community. So we did a lot of legwork to identify not only the known partners, but the greater community, from regulators to neighborhood groups, land managers, a local bike coalition, political representatives, park users, and of course, key decision makers. So we brought everyone together for fresh air, food, and conversation. We did a morning of technical presentations followed by a field visit and then a hike at China Camp State Park. So here's kind of a lot of acronyms and words, but just to show, this was our very initial sort of laying out who were the key parties. And the key thing is the people, right? This is a big community of interests, and these were just sort of the initial folks that rose to the surface. So NERR as a whole has a very strong relationship with our partners, state parks, Friends of China Camp, the regulators, the scientific community, but we don't have a big presence at the park itself. So we don't have offices there. There's very little signage acknowledging the NERR, and we're a small staff and we're very only occasionally on site. So many folks at the symposium were very excited to learn about what we were doing. And it so happened that our county supervisor's aide was on the walk that we did and spent the day with us. And she got very excited because he is on a commission for looking at sea level rise in the county. So because of that, she really helped us, connect us to him, his office, and the county at whole to really build this connection between the NERR and the county. And soon after, we decided to go after more funding to solve this wicked problem in earnest with these key partners. So many entities are really passionate about the park. And we remained engaged with our attendees from the symposium, sort of using that as momentum to keep us going to build a bigger and more robust stakeholder group to sort of tackle some of the short-term issues that were happening at the park. So with this stakeholder support, we had some short-term meetings to look at topics around better signage and education about when the road floods, because many locals didn't even understand about extreme tides and extreme weather events and when the road would be closed or when it wasn't. And officially, the road doesn't even get officially closed. It just floods and people decide to drive through it. We also sort of looked at restriping the roads and worked with the county to slip line those existing very small culverts to at least open the flow where some of it was completely blocked. But in addition to these short-term challenges, we really wanted to tackle this much bigger topic of what are we going to do about the road. So we worked to pursue funding to tackle this adaptation planning process. And there's lots of opportunities for shovel-ready projects, but it can be really hard to find the funds to help with planning. So we were successful in being granted another NERRS Science Collaborative grant in 2018, a Catalyst grant. So this is a lot of boxes and arrows, but basically this is the project approach for our Catalyst grant, titled Bringing Together End Users and Stakeholders to Identify and Evaluate Sea Level Rise Adaptation Options to Solve Red Flooding in Chinacamp State Park. So basically the gist of this phase of the project was to develop goals, objectives, and feasibility considerations. And this was, not a simple project because there's lots of competing interests and parties, and, being a county road in a state park, not necessarily complete alignment on how to handle that as well. But through this process, we had a lot of really fantastic, well-moderated meetings, and we worked to develop options and recommend alternatives. And in the end, we had 5 alternatives to bring forward to the next phase. The project also had some key outputs that we will continue to refer back to as we continue with this work, as in an existing conditions report, an alternatives report, and then a roadmap sort of laying out what the steps were to actually get us towards construction. So helping bring all the stakeholders, maybe not so familiar with these type of processes, in on what this was going to really take to really get this project going. So for the next phase, we decided that we kind of needed some big money and some heavy hitters, and we invited our local congressman out to the park. And luckily, he lives in San Rafael, which is the city where Chinacamp State Park is located, and he was very excited to do some birding with us, have a conversation, and kind of, help us look towards federal funding to get this project moving forward. So we've submitted several proposals for different aspects of the work, and we actually decided to sort of parse it out into different components. We haven't been successful on all of our proposals, but we were luckily successful in our research grant proposal to the NERRS Science Collaborative. So one key thing I want to mention is that this is not the most traveled road that floods in the county and not the most critical infrastructure in the region by far. But the uniqueness of the habitat and the importance of the marsh elevates the need for this project beyond just the transportation issues. So our research proposal that was just funded and started in 2021 is called Integrating Cultural and Natural Resources into Community-Based Sea Level Rise Adaptation Planning for the Chinacamp Shoreline Road. So we're going to be doing both cultural and hydrological data collection to help inform the alternative selection. We know that Chinacamp is not only currently used very actively culturally by the tribes, but also it's not well documented. So all of the archaeological resources and existing cultural resources. So we are trying to work with them to look at how these alternatives might fit or not fit with their priorities. We just had our first stakeholder meeting, and we had about 50 stakeholders in attendance. And like I said, this project team also expanded to include tribal representatives, state park archaeologists, and cultural liaisons. We just also received full State Historic Preservation Officer permission and state park research permits to begin our field work. And we're really excited to be moving forward on this. So this project will help inform alternative selection and meanwhile maintaining the high level of stakeholder engagement from the prior phases as well. But like I said, this doesn't cover all the needed tasks, so we're still pursuing additional funding to do the paired engineering exploration with the Department of Public Works from the county. But once the engineering is fully secured, we'll be able to move forward towards design and construction. And super optimistically, we're hoping within the next 5 years. So what started as a very early conversation on what role the NERR could play in tackling this problem has shifted towards our being sort of the leader, us leading the charge and coordinating all the efforts around funding, engagement, and research. So sorry to keep throwing these approach diagrams at you, but I think it's helpful to sort of see the flow of what we intend to do and then how that leads to the outputs and outcomes. So here are research questions around both the hydrology and the cultural resources, and sort of highlighting how we intend for the different project components and folks to work with us, and all the while maintaining a really high level of stakeholder engagement. So can't thank the Neuroscience Collaborative enough. In tandem, I also am working on a transfer grant with the other 2 California CTPs. So working with Tijuana River and Elkhorn Slough CTPs, I'm not sure if they're here today, but shout out to them if they are. Resilient Roads and Reserves is a smaller transfer grant that we also started in 2021. And we're also talking about roads and critical natural habitats. So many of our reserves around the system have very similar issues with roads and flooding, sea level rise topics, and just infrastructure that's endangered in general. And so we want to look at how we can better engage in the planning processes and involving the dual management concerns for flood vulnerable roads and adjacent coastal habitats. And we want to shed light on our projects and our process, and looking at the opportunities to learn from each other and develop case studies and a status report to share at the state level. And like I said, last approach diagram, but here's what we're laying out for our transfer grant, how the 3 reserves are going to be working together, meeting, developing a stakeholder workshop for the Central Coast, and then hopefully taking all of what we learn and condensing it down into an issue brief that we will take to state level decision maker meetings. So there's no one single way to make progress. And I feel incredibly fortunate that, the small capacity building grant really did launch a much bigger, broader process for us and really put the NERRS sort of at the helm of, getting traction on this terrible issue with the road that had just been neglected for so long. So, it started with a conversation that really hatched an idea, and the momentum continues to build. So I'm greatly appreciative of all the support in all ways from the Neuroscience Collaborative, beyond just the funding. They have such a wonderful staff, and we've gotten so much help from graphic design for our reports to doing webinars like this to help us engage with other members in the community. And also just, thanks to everyone in the reserve system. It is a big family, and I'm very happy to be part of it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Aimee. Some of the things that popped out from the titles, relevant to today's conversation, just the titles bringing together end users, community-based, civilized adaptation planning. I feel like you could probably just take the content of those titles and just swap them out with any other important coastal management issue, because the concept there is bringing people together to discuss. Do we have, so thank you for that. Is Kaitlyn on the phone?
Yes, I'm here. How's that audio?
Oh, that's fantastic. You feel free to turn on your camera if you want to. We could see you, but it's not, with the phone. So we'll just go back a little bit to our earlier, or where we were starting, and why don't you go ahead and take us from the top?
All right, thanks so much. So as I was saying, I'm not sure how much of it was heard, but we are here in Northeast Florida, and our reserve spans about 76,000 acres between St. Johns and Flagler counties. And we are a small staff of maybe 30, so we do not directly manage all of those 76,000 acres. And there are a network of public lands within our boundaries that we are already partners with, making sure that we understand how we are all managing the lands that we have direct management over, and having conversations about best management practices and coastal issues that we're all experiencing. And as probably with all of the reserves, we rely heavily on our data to make sure that we are making the best decisions to conserve our natural biodiversity and cultural resources, which leads perfectly into our next slide of how we got to where we are today. So when our research coordinator started here at the GTM Research Reserve in 2013, there was not much data about our local oyster populations. We knew that shellfish harvesting areas had been closed since 1995. There was a lot of public concern about that. We knew that we had been collecting water quality data through the reserve system-wide monitoring program since 2002, but not much more than that. We didn't know what our oysters looked like. We didn't really have a good understanding of locally how our water quality impacted our local oysters. Did we have healthy oysters? Did we have a good population of oysters? What is a good population of oysters? And those questions kicked off many efforts to understand this important, not only ecological, but cultural resource. So in 2014, we decided, let's go and start monitoring the oysters. So we started a monitoring program which monitored natural populations of oysters at 200 reefs throughout the reserve boundaries. And that program has continued since 2014. And reef metrics were characterized as reef structure, oyster population structure, community structure, and our team collected data for reef height, percent cover, oyster density, size class frequencies, and much more. But we knew that this was what we could do, and that oysters were being monitored throughout the country and throughout the state. So we knew we needed to talk to other folks to get a better idea on monitoring our oysters. So with those, with that initial start of the reserve's monitoring efforts, the reserve and a local organization called the Estuaries Foundation applied and received a NERR Science Collaborative Capacity Building Grant. And the reserve and the foundation were awarded the capacity building funds in 2015 to create an estuarine research consortium for Northeast Florida that would cross agencies, universities, and public stakeholder groups. And the goal was really to build and expand the capacity of those entities to understand more about estuarine issues, whether they were web or water quality or oyster related, and to help generate competitive neuroscience collaborative proposals. The consortium met several times, and they identified management and research needs that those different entities had, and helped really strengthen the reserve's relationships with local universities and other entities that had conservation management plans. And to date, we are still working with those universities. In fact, one of the professors that was part of that initial effort is a key player in a neuroscience collaborative research pre-proposal that we recently submitted. The consortium led to many other collaborative projects, including an oyster condition assessment project, which was funded by our local St. Johns River Water Management District, where we surveyed oyster reefs throughout Northeast Florida and compared sampling techniques with other entities that were also sampling oysters. And that data fed into a statewide effort to consistently collect oyster data. It also supported a NERRS Science Collaborative Catalyst project called Stakeholder-Driven Modeling to Understand Oyster Population Sustainability, where the reserve worked with researchers from Northeastern University and Oregon State University to examine the influence of environmental factors on oysters and the oyster population dynamics in different zones within the reserve using stakeholder feedback and field data. And while the consortium has dissolved, it really brought awareness to water quality and oyster issues and enthusiasm to partners. And it's really driven a lot of the collaborative efforts that the Reserve has been a part of since 2014. The relationships that started with the consortium have continued today, and we're very thankful for the capacity building funds because there were just so many efforts to collaborate on and really strengthen the reach of the Reserve. One of those concurrent efforts that benefited from the relationships that were fostered in the consortium was a 2014 internship that was actually funded by a local business owner to assess water quality and other issues related to sustainable oyster fisheries here in Northeast Florida. I was the intern for it, so that's exciting to kind of be a part of this process from the beginning. One of the products of the internship was a Shuck and Tell event, which is the photo that you see now, where the Reserve invited local shellfish harvesters to a boat ramp to literally shuck and tell. They brought oysters that they had harvested that we roasted over a fire at the boat ramp. And we captured oral history from personal accounts, collected anecdotal information about how shellfish had changed in their lifetimes, how it had changed in their families' lifetimes, and really built strong relationships with the harvesters. And we still work with a lot of the folks in the picture there today. Another product of that internship was a final report that synthesized all of the available reports within the area, synthesized monitoring data and harvesting history and maps that were available. That final report included a list of recommendations for the Reserve staff moving forward. And one of those recommendations was to reinvigorate an oyster and water quality task force from 1997. So the Oyster and Water Quality Task Force is another example of an effort that was happening concurrently with the consortium, and I think there was a lot of relationship overlap there. This Oyster and Water Quality Task Force is a robust voluntary stakeholder group that has met quarterly since 2015 to share emerging issues, prioritize and support research, and discuss potential management applications related to oyster sustainability and water quality. To date, the task force has supported numerous collaborative projects, several of them being funded by the NERRS Science Collaborative, which the photo on this slide is actually one of those projects. And the task force operates on actions and objectives to guide a lot of the conversations and prioritize the research. And many of those actions and objectives were actually guided by the initial consortium in that capacity building grant. So we're continuing to use those efforts today. And since all of the efforts really kicked off in 2014 with that capacity building grant, the partnerships that we've developed over the past now almost 8 years have really driven our understanding here at the Reserve. In 2017, we kicked off a 5-year monthly water quality sampling effort with our local Audubon Society, our local citizen support organization, Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and a division in our state agency for environmental assessment and restoration in Guana Lake, which is a local water body actually right behind our building here. And the data from this sampling effort indicated high levels of chlorophyll A and other nutrients, as well as sucralose, which is actually an indicator for treated human wastewater. And the north of the water body, there are 5 wastewater management facilities. There are septic tanks. There are golf courses and residential irrigation. And so there are a variety of potential sources for those nutrients and sucralose. And so that 5-year water quality sampling effort has actually led to a current NERRS Science Collaborative project that we call Guana Nutrients, Budgets, and Bivalves, because every project needs a catchy name. And this project will help identify sources of those nutrients to the Guana River estuary and determine how nutrient loads from the lake are affecting a river and how that hydrology and land use are a part of that. It will help us map current distribution of shellfish communities and quantify filtration and nitrogen removal by shellfish. And the goal at the end of that is to know where those potential pollutants are coming from or sources of nutrients, and work with land managers and work with the municipalities that oversee some of the utilities in the area, and work with the residents in the area to help address and protect the water within the Guana River system. And then there have been many other efforts that have stemmed off of those relationships. In 2018, we worked with several partners from a citizen support organization, the University of Florida, and reserve staff to do some bacterial source tracking in the southern component of our reserve. And we collected samples that were tested for chemical tracers to determine if human wastewater was found in Pellicer Creek, which was a concern because we're starting to see a lot more development happening in our more southern component. Fortunately, there were no sites that had raw human wastewater contamination, but we did have several areas where those sucralose levels were elevated. And so that data gave us a glimpse into a potential pollution source. And we need more sampling. And so this might be a project that we go forward with future Science Collaborative funding and try to add additional sampling and prioritize and implement best management practices before that area becomes too developed and there are more impacts. In a recent exciting part of this story, so in September of 2021, our Florida Department of Environmental Protection released a draft water quality assessment list, which includes data sets from all of the projects that I've already mentioned today. And these assessments are conducted according to EPA's Clean Water Act and Florida's Impaired Water Rule. And the data that we've been able to collect through all of these partnerships and collaborations have actually been able to show that there are several impaired water bodies within the reserve that need some attention and need a reasonable assurance plan before a TMDL is developed. And so, thanks to those projects and the collaborations that we fostered over time and the persistence of our staff and our partners, we are beginning that journey to understand what we need to do, who we need to engage with to make sure that we can move forward and protect the waters that are no longer meeting their criteria. And hopefully we'll see some big changes moving forward. So that's a quick story of how just a small conversation, as Aimee said, started off, and the capacity building grants really has driven a lot of the efforts here at the reserve. And that's all that I've got to share for right now.
Thank you so much, Kaitlyn, and thanks for being flexible and using old technology for our fancy virtual conversation we're having today. Of course, you talked about oysters and shucking, and it's lunchtime over here on the West Coast, so now I'm hungry. So thank you for that. One thing that just kind of continuing that theme of parts of titles, something that you identified, and one of yours was stakeholder driven. So I mean, there's so many different ways to say something about bringing people together to do the research and do the science. So just wanted to highlight that. While we're bringing up our remaining couple of slides, I just have a few quick questions. We are getting questions from the audience, so I'd like to remind everybody listening to us and watching, if you have questions, please share them in the chat, and they will make their way into into our conversation, and those that don't, we will be posting a Q&A on our site later with answers from Kaitlyn and Aimee to any questions we weren't able to answer live. So please feel free to unlock your ideas and questions as you'd like. So my first question to kind of kick us off is, and Kaitlyn, you were starting to get to this with your last couple of comments too, but looking back at the overall effort, which, you know, surrounding the partnership building and the capacity building elements from the earliest stages, what difference has the work made in what you're seeing in the reserve and the issues that matter now? So how have things sort of evolved? And you know, Aimee, you kind of had mentioned earlier something around ownership. So if you could maybe start with that, sort of how that has evolved. Ownership of the road.
Well, I would say, you know, it was kind of one of those situations where everyone's sort of standing, pointing in a circle, right? Like who's going to take the lead here? Who's going to take the initiative? Who's going to deal with this? So I think just laying the foundation first of establishing NERR sort of as a neutral body, because we're not the landowner, we're not the land manager, you know, and it's a state park with actually a friends group that runs the day-to-day operations of the park, even adding an extra layer. And then part of the marsh is owned by California Audubon. So there's all these different actual, you know, land owning, land managing entities, kind of no one wanting to take the lead. So we were able to establish ourselves just sort of as a reference point and bringing everybody together to have these conversations and to diffuse any tension, because the county and state parks also have other roads in the county that they've been battling over. So sort of, it all comes down to the people, which is not to say that this all has been just smooth and roses and wonderful. There's been a lot of turnover since we started. The head of Department of Public Works for the county retired. There was an interim person we brought in. Now there's a new head, you know, so there's constantly moving pieces, but I think keeping, being very transparent in our process and having lots and lots and lots of conversations and working together to develop shared goals. I think that's really, really key.
I'm going to pick up that shared goals and ask Kaitlyn the same question around, obviously dialogue is something that allows those creation of shared goals. So what can you build on from what Aimee said or shared from her experience here in California?
I think Aimee made a really great point about the reserve being able to be that neutral ground and just bring all of the right folks together. And, you know, I think this has been, I mentioned earlier, a decade-long sort of process for us. And we've had to develop and strengthen and restart over some of those relationships. But I think that the ability to have open and respectful dialogue has really increased the capacity of the reserve and our partners to know what's happening in the reserve, as well as having that comfort level to investigate and address issues. You know, ask questions if you don't know how a process works, and be open to, you know, potentially a more challenging route, but being open to giving a little bit more than you might have initially thought you were going to have to in order to get the goal that you're ultimately after.
That's great. Thank you both for those answers. And I'm seeing more questions coming in, so I'm going to just get to our second seated question and then get to what the audience would like to hear or talk about too, which is how do you know an idea is worth pursuing through partnerships and collaboration versus going it alone? And then throwing in a great example of today's, you know, the virtual world has impacted. How has that impacted your thinking around picking an idea and sort of, you know, bringing people together versus like, we can do this on our own? So who'd like to pick that one first?
I can start again. Oh, okay, unless you want to go, Kaitlyn.
go for it.
Okay. So we're a super, super small reserve. You know, we kind of oscillate between like 5 and 7 staff members. And like I said, we're not land owners or land managers. So we only exist because of partnerships, right? We can't do it alone. But I also think that the stronger and the more effort we put into our partnerships, the more success we've had. So I think that's something that, I mean, I consider I'm one person running my program, but half of the work that I do is with partners around the region. And I use that word very loosely, right? That could be somebody that I'm funded with on a jointly together on a grant, or it can be someone that has an idea that says, hey, let's do this workshop together kind of thing. And I sort of define partner very, very broadly. And I would say here, the Bay region, we're pretty spread out. I mean, Rush Ranch is an hour away from where I live, and our headquarters is a half an hour away, and everybody's kind of all over the place. So we've been using virtual technology for a while, but I think, definitely, like one of my colleagues was like, I'm going to limit myself to 5 Zooms a day, right? Like it gets a little insane. And especially with COVID, like this Zoom overload is real. But we've been trying to use it to our advantage and overcome, transportation issues and, commuting and all of that, and really try to find ways to make it as interactive as possible, because it does get pretty boring just staring at a screen all day.
Let's say that today we're having an amazing webinar. Kaitlyn, what about you? What you want to pick up on that virtual and kind of back up to?
I think we're both part of the coastal training program, and it's kind of part of our process to always look for opportunities to collaborate with partners, because in order to address many of these coastal and estuarine issues that we're facing, there are many different perspectives, and every partner brings their own values and their own resources, which are important to make sure that those projects are successful, and that we want to make sure that what we're putting our time and what is important for maintaining our natural biodiversity and our cultural resources, we want to make sure that they're successful projects. As far as virtual opportunities, with everybody using virtual platforms now, I think we've been able to leverage creative ways to foster relationships. It's a little different. There's always something that's a little bit better about having everyone gather around your project site and seeing the issues themselves. But we've still been able to really develop good relationships and, that trust and that safe space for respectful dialogue in the virtual world. And it's created opportunities for us to work with people across the country, folks that we might not initially think of as a resource.
I think that's really, I like that expansion across the country. It goes without saying, we've all gotten used to this virtual experience of interacting with people across time zones. So thank you for mentioning that element. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit. We have a number of questions that have come in, and by all means, please, if there's things that are still popping up in your mind, we welcome your contributions. The first question is going to Aimee, and the question is, can you share more about how you will engage tribes to collect their input?
Yeah, so we actually, it's kind of hard to define their role because they don't like the bins that we tend to put things in. So they are officially project team members from sort of a grant perspective, but they're also above and beyond all of that. So we, on this current phase, we're working with Sonoma State has the Anthropological Sciences Center. And so they're doing some really creative work with LIDAR, looking back in the past to where the historical water levels were and where, villages may have been, and also looking forward to with sea level rise, where current known archaeological resources will be impacted. So working with them, who work very closely with our local tribe, as well as a consultant who is a tribal liaison. And we have an amazing anthropologist at state parks who has a very close relationship with the tribe. So working through them. We actually don't yet have, direct one-to-one interaction, but so far they're really excited about this work, and also that we brought them in early, right? We absolutely included them in the earlier phases of work where they weren't as active, but in this phase we're compensating them. We're having tribal monitors when we're doing any field work or any exploration of any type, and as Doug knows all too well, going through the SHPO process, that making sure that all of our plans are being, taking their consideration at the forefront. So we're building the relationship slowly, and right now it's through the experts that are already tapped in to the local tribe.
Yeah, I think the SHPO process, I think I mentioned this during our stakeholder meeting last week, NOAA is learning as much in that process as well. So and how we can assist and be as streamlined and efficient with what we're communicating. So so for all the states that have collaborative project or any projects that require some SHPO contact, there's all of them. There's transferable lessons in both directions going on. So thank you for that, Aimee. So the next question is for both of you. So Kaitlyn, feel free to start, and then Aimee, you can bat second on this one. So both Aimee and Kaitlyn talked about how the Science Collaborative Capacity Building grants really helped them launch these collaborative relationship building efforts. And the question is, I'm curious as to how the actual funding was used. So was it staff time, travel, food, materials? And then Kaitlyn, connected to this, did the consortium dissolved, and what was the reasoning behind that? Was it related to funding, or it reached a natural conclusion? So two parts there. So what were the funds used for? And then specifically, Kaitlyn, what happened to the consortium's lifespan?
Those are great questions. So the funding was used for the Estuaries Foundation to hire a staff person to help pull together a lot of the Northeast Florida's management plans and really do an in-depth analysis of what, similarities, issues, challenges to bring to a lot of the collaborative stakeholder meetings. So that was where a good portion of that funding went to, was that person's time. And then also for meeting facilitation, there is funding that is required to bring people together, whether it is physical space for the meeting, whether it is coffee and refreshments to make sure that you are providing a comfortable space for everyone. So that's really where the funds went. The reason that the consortium dissolved was the person who was leading it had to take a step back. And at that time, it came to kind of a natural breaking point. But the partnerships and those relationships that were started in that consortium, I think really fed into a lot of the Oyster and Water Quality Task Force relationships. So even though they happened concurrently around the same time, I think the task force was really able to use a lot of what the consortium had previously worked on.
Thank you, Kaitlyn. Aimee, what were your funds used for?
Yeah, pretty similar. A little bit of staff time to sort of lay the groundwork, do all the outreach and the engagement, sort of build the stakeholder list, the initial stakeholder list, identifying all the players, and then the actual day of the symposium, renting the room to hold the morning session, provide the lunch, provide some transportation, and handouts and poster boards and things like that for that field portion.
So a variety of things. I think hopefully the audience is listening. There's these capacity funds can be used in a lot of different ways. So we are 2 minutes before top of the hour, depending on your time zone, whether it's 1 o'clock or 5 o'clock. And I'd like to respect everybody's time. We do have other questions, so I might want to pull people back later to our website where we might have some more information. we'll talk with Kaitlyn and Aimee and get that information out. But in our last minute, I want to ask each Kaitlyn and Aimee just one thing, if you could think of one thing that surprised you during the capacity building, partnership building process. So you could think of one thing that surprised you, what would it have been?
I think how willing and open everyone was to share information and to dive into figuring out the next steps.
I would say the fact that there were so many folks that visit the park all the time that had never heard of the NERR, right? That we were kind of an unknown entity, and everyone asks, "Why don't you have a sign?" So that's a state park question. If there's anyone here from state parks.
I was going to say different agency. Okay, good question. All right. Well, thank you so much, Kaitlyn. Thank you, Aimee, for joining us. Thank you, audience, for participating and for your questions. And I don't remember if there's any other slides that we have to show, but if not, oh, we do. All right. Our next webinar is going to be at the end of March. So please watch your email for that to be coming, as well as on the calendars. And this recording will be available on our YouTube channel in the next few days. So again, thank you to both Kaitlyn and Aimee for a wonderful conversation. And everyone, please enjoy the rest of your day wherever you may be.
Thank you.